These things I remember as I pour out my soul, how I went with the throng and led them in possession to the house of God, with glad shouts and songs of thanksgiving, a multitude keeping festival. While I was at uni, I was in my lodgings. I was asleep and I had a visit, and the voice said, I am the Alpha and the Omega. So I thought it was Adam. I was stood by this tree, and underneath this tree I had an apple, beautiful big red apple. This man come approach me and I said, excuse me, would you like to share my apple? And he looked, he went, that's very kind of you. I went, it's all right. So I cut the apple in half and we were talking. And this man, very genteel, very striking eyes, very soft, very comforting manner. And I turned around and didn't eat my part of the apple. And I said, would you like another piece of apple? And he said, you're very kind, very caring. Goes round this campfire and sat down. And he turned around to me and he said, why do you try to use big words? And I said, I don't mean to use big words. I don't understand big words. People don't listen to me. He said, what do you mean? And I said, I find it very hard to put my point across on paper, let alone in speaking to somebody. He went, you'll be heard. He said, try to be yourself and be honest with yourself and true. You won't remember everything what I say to you. We got up and he was walking away, and as he was waving, and I went, oh my gosh, I know who you are. I went, you're Jesus. And he waved and he went like that as he was walking away. And all I heard was, you've got it right, or something like that. And I've kept that memory with me all the time. And I thought, I've just been visited by Jesus. I've been visited by his angels. I've been visited by God himself. Living with schizophrenia and knowing that God is by your side is a positive aspect. He may not answer you as an immediate solution, but the end result can be more rewarding than what you can ever anticipate. It's taken me to here, so I'm going to be heard. So Jesus was right. I grew up in the Catholic faith, had a lot of misgivings about the Catholic faith. When I was in junior school, there was a lot of prejudice and racism due to unethical and unmoral behaviour towards black individuals as black children, always correcting our speech, not having an understanding that we will say things differently, but it means the same thing. With the faith, I got frightened from certain nuns and one particular priest. I looked at the faith as a very unsharing, uncaring and unloving aspects. There was only one or two within the ministry who was very loving and giving and understanding and nurturing to help me to understand how I was feeling and fitting into the environment and the society that I was growing up in.
Stigma occurs when you take one small piece of an individual and make it the whole of them. If you have a highly stigmatized diagnosis like schizophrenia, as soon as you have that diagnosis, people can't say anything else. But everything is filtered through that diagnosis. And usually the filter that's used is false. And so stigma just takes away the whole personhood of an individual. And our society is full of stigma. You can see it in media, you can see it in papers, you can see it in social media. So all of us are primed to think negatively about mental health issues. And so it's not surprising that when somebody gets a diagnosis like that they share that same stigma, but this time they ascribe it to themselves. And so that cultural stigma that all of us take in, consciously or unconsciously, suddenly it becomes yourself. You get your diagnosis, and suddenly everything I thought about them is now me. And so you're going through really difficult experiences anyway, and then suddenly you find yourself with this added stigma, not just from your friends and family and everybody else in the street, but from yourself.
You don't have to talk for long to people with mental illness to know that stigma is a reality for them. You know, the number of people who say to me, actually, the experience of how people treat me because of my illness is worse than the experience of the illness itself. That's what really makes it disabling. And I think that's a reality for people in society. It's a reality for people in churches. As Christians, we carry the same kind of prejudices and attitudes as the society around us very, very, very often. So I think that's absolutely a reality and absolutely out there.
I got into a university in Lancaster, and during my time studying religion and ethics, I was going through a very difficult phase in my life. I ended up having a breakdown, and I went to Downton Memorial Hospital, and the unit there for psychiatric clients was very scary. I started to feel strange, couldn't sleep, hearing voices, going through a lot of trauma, fear of going to sleep, fear of staying awake. Would study intensively because of my learning disability, financial problems and everything, and relationship problems. Extreme fear, I was petrified. And the more I was petrified, the more they were getting stronger, the voices were getting stronger, the things what I was seeing was getting more demonic. Just everything just enclosed in on me, imploded, that I thought, there's no way out of this. I was in a really bad place, very alone, very emotional. It's an area which I wouldn't like anyone else to go through. It has been a test, and it will always be a test.
Being stigmatized, there's a theory, which I would say is very accurate, that people experience, which is self-stigma. So it means that once someone's stigmatized and they're told they're worthless, they're nothing but their diagnosis, they are no longer valid. Whatever the message is that they get from their stigma, they internalize that and they believe that. So if you're told, actually, you don't really have value or anything to offer us, if the more you hear that, the more you're going to believe that, the more you're going to go, I don't have anything to offer. I have no value. I'm not worth anything. I'm not worth someone's time to spend time with me in church. There's the exclusion from community. I'm not worth time in people getting to know me. I'm not worth being loved. I think that self-stigma is insidious and can be incredibly dangerous and damaging. And unless you have a really strong voice that can come against that, there's different ways in which that becomes internalized and different degrees of severity, but it can be incredibly damaging and harmful. And coming out of stigma and no longer experiencing that is hard.
So to recover from self-stigma, it's helpful to recognize that the shame that we carry inside of us, the stigma that has been internalized, isn't something that we were born with. It isn't something that we started with. It's something we learned. And if it's something that we learned, it can be something that we unlearn as well. Bringing in compassion, bringing in a new way of thinking about ourselves, understanding perhaps more accurate stories about our mental health issues besides the ones that are perpetrated culturally, gives us a wider story of being human, a wider story of our suffering, which instead of us needing to beat ourselves up to try to make our suffering go away, actually allows us to see ourselves still within the love of God, even if there is something that we're struggling with.
I used to have a stigma myself about mental illness. When I was younger, in the 80s, there was a lot of stigma of the violence about those who have schizophrenia. When I end up with the diagnosis, it's taken me many years to understand who I am and who schizophrenia is, to learn that it's not all negative. There's a lot of positive aspects with the individuals who are living with schizophrenia than to have the stigma of schizophrenia. Oh, keep away, you know what I mean? She's totally certified madness and she's violent and that. So you're thinking negative of yourself.
Language creates the worlds in which we inhabit, and the language that's used around mental health is I am language, which is something that I'm sure many of us have heard before. I am depressed, I am bipolar, I am schizophrenic, I am anorexic, etc., etc. They're I am, and those labels become a way in which it speaks of the person's essence, who that person is. They're no longer Hannah, they are depressed. That's how they're viewed. And I think that one of the problems within church is, again, that we can use those medical languages or medical models or diagnoses to understand a person and not understand the person for their strengths, their weaknesses, their character attributes, likes, dislikes. That's something that we should seek to do and to seek to do better.
One psychiatrist said, because you're black, because you're female, because you're learning disabilities, you have schizophrenia, this is the reason why, so I'll put you in that label, in that category. And I turned around and I said, one, I don't fit into no category. Two, I am an individual. You do not look at me as a label or a number. You look at me and look at my profile, and then you diagnose me on those facts, not on what you have read or what you have studied to fit me into a criteria which label me as a negative. You see me as someone, as an individual, which I see is positive. I'm learning from it. I'm growing from it. How can you put a face on learning disability, mental disability? How can you put a face on a racial discrimination? How can you put a face to it? You can't, because it's in different sizes, it's in different bodies, it's in different ways of dealing with things. You could be racist and have all these things, all the negative aspects on that one person or a group of people. So how can you turn around and give that a structural image? You can't. So don't put me in that same light. It needs to be voiced that there's good people out there, than all the media aspects of saying it's always a negative person who have schizophrenia that does the extreme crime cases and things like that.
If we're being serious about addressing mental health issues, we have to be attentive to the spiritual components of it, the psychological, emotional components of it, the physical components of it, and then you've got to be attentive to even sociocultural and, quite frankly, even economic aspects as well. There's no mention of sexism or racism in the DSM, but we all know that trauma, stress related to sexism, racism have serious implications for mental health. Many of us live in capitalist contexts, and we've seen the increasing widening of the wealth gap. Poverty has implications for mental health. Too many practitioners on the mental health side, particularly even on the secular side, do not themselves consider all of those factors when developing treatment interventions and so forth and so on. So it's a multiplicity of factors that hinder people both from recognizing, and even once the recognition is made, to engaging services. And then even once services are engaged, the type of services designed that are attentive to all of those areas. It's really challenging. The need of the church with a level of intentionality to engage the margins, to engage the disenfranchised. If we could take that one piece, I think it would do wonders as it relates to addressing the issues of mental health that so many people on the margins are experiencing.
Individuals who are struggling with mental health issues, just like each of us, have this very unique story. And just asking somebody, what's your story? Making that connection, and then finding out how God is alive and at work in this person throughout the good times, the times of struggle, and just to, if you will, humanize the person and to see the person in front of you as opposed to the disease, disorder, whatever it is.
Jesus just really loves people who are defined by something that shouldn't define them. He loves it so much that even in a crowd, when a woman with a blood condition over many years secretly touches his robe and is healed, and he stops everything and says, "Who touched me?" Because it's important to him that she is restored to community, that she's seen, and that she's no longer defined by her illness. So I think Jesus is about radically welcoming outsiders into the kingdom of God. But what I think we need to make sure we understand is he's drawing a new circle around himself, right? Like it's not that there's no boundaries anymore. It's that the boundaries are drawn around him and his welcome and embrace of those who've been stigmatized and who are now being defined and finding their identity in him. I think the other thing that the church needs to keep in mind, and if we want to move towards people who are stigmatized, is to not reduce them to a project. How do we move toward people in the same way Christ does without reducing them in a different way? I mean, we're trying to get over the label, but now they're just a thing to help instead of a person to meet and encounter and be with.
The church needs to look at the individual first. Listen, if they can, about that person. Then listen to them about their illness. The idea of just pray is not enough. They need talking to about every aspect of their life. So I've been lucky. I've found a handful of places that has nurtured me throughout of all my trials and tribulations. But not just the trials and tribulations. Trying to understand my own home environment, my own culture, and learning that there's good people out there. And there's people who's not going to be patronizing to you and saying, "Oh, well, I know someone who's like that," or, "Oh, well, you just have to shrug it off." Having schizophrenia is not something that you can shrug off. It's there for life. It's nice to have somebody to listen to you within the church and to help you to grow, to learn, to adapt, and to live with schizophrenia, and to live with the faith that I have, that God's by my side.
Come on then.
Learning to live with schizophrenia, and now I'm learning to live with dementia with my mum. It's hard, very hard, because I'm still learning about my condition and I've got to learn about hers. And sometimes it clashes, and sometimes I feel that I'm out my depth. Other times I feel that I'm doing okay, and we have those special moments. When there is a hand that can guide you through God, through somebody who's caring, it will be inspiring to know that there's someone there who may be able to help you. The devil is not going to conquer me. I've got God by me. He's with me. He's in me. He's around me. He supports me. He nurtures me. He takes me through every aspect of my living days and nights. These things I remember as I pour out my soul, how I went with the throng and led them in possession to the house of God, with glad shouts and songs of thanksgiving, a multitude keeping festival